Welcome back, everyone, to part 4 of our look at the Articles of Confederation through the eyes of extra history. I hope you guys have enjoyed the series as much as I have. It's been fantastic just watching it being presented in Extra Credit's way of presenting things. I think they've done a great job, as they do with most of their stuff. I hope you guys have enjoyed the conversation that we've been able to have about these events, and I'm looking forward to having that conversation with this episode as well. So I'm not going to add anything to it. We're just going to dive right in. If you didn't see the first 3 episodes of my reaction, there's a link in the description that'll take you back to episode 1. As well as links to a bunch of different things, including my social media. People ask me about things like Instagram. My Instagram link is there. Check out all of those links. I'll also link the original content creator. Let's dive into part 4.
In faraway Paris, diplomats put pen to paper and signed the treaty that would end the American Revolutionary War. A copy of this document sailed across the ocean, where it would need delegations from 9 states to ratify it under the Articles of Confederation and accept their victory. Only 7 states showed up. 1 month after the Confederation's embarrassing failure to bring the states together long enough to sign their own peace treaty, they reconvened with just enough people to get it done. The war had ended. Peace had come. George Washington welcomed this with open arms.
So you got to think about this for a second. If it was that hard to get the necessary 9 states to ratify a treaty that would end the war and give them a country of their own, free from British rule, how are you going to get anything substantive done with that kind of stubbornness on the part of your government? You're certainly not going to pass any taxes. You're certainly not going to pass anything significant that's going to benefit you in any way.
He had won the love of the nation and the respect of its statesmen. Some speculated, or even hoped, that he would use his popularity and the army he controlled to install himself as the new leader of this fledgling country. Instead, he resigned. He gave his power back to Congress and declared that he wanted to return home. And
this is a one of the marks of George Washington's greatness was his recognition of the potential for having too much power. People would have made him a monarch in a second if he had done the tiniest bit to indicate he was willing to do that. Washington, what set him apart from many leaders throughout history was his willingness to have all the power in the world and just let go of it. And he did this time and again. He does it here when he resigns, and they have this whole thing in New York City where he says farewell to the army. When he steps down, it happens again when he is told that he's the only man who can unite the country under a constitution. So he's the president of the Constitutional Convention. He's the president of the United States. And after his second term, he's still in his mid to late 60s, and he decides to walk away, even though he could have continued to serve.
Live out the rest of his life in peace as an ordinary citizen. All he asked was that they find a way to pay his soldiers. He hoped that they would be able to do that by giving his soldiers free land in the West to build new homes. This was the same issue that, years ago, had divided the states so badly that it almost tore the Confederation apart. Back when Maryland had first raised a stink about the Western Territory, Virginia had decided to assert its control over the region by selling land to settlers so that good Virginia citizens could spread into the West. But those eager settlers had soon run into a teeny-tiny problem. There was still a war going on, and the British held military forts in the West. When those settlers had asked their home state to send troops to defend them, Virginia said, "We're kind of busy fighting this war back home, and we don't have any troops we can spare for you, so good luck."
And there was a lot of fighting that took place on what was then the frontier. And there were actually, if you ever do research into your family history and you find that someone is listed as an Indian scout, what that meant was that their job was to be out on the frontier to keep an eye out for any Native American incursions. And a lot of those Native American tribes were allied with the British because the British were promising to keep the settlers from coming into that land, whereas the Americans wanted to occupy it. And so you can see why naturally the Native Americans would want to side with the British in a situation like that.
Those settlers were not happy. They learned to fend for themselves, but by the time the war ended, many considered themselves to be independent from both sides, and a few had even discussed joining Spain or France. The West was a mess. But it also represented an opportunity for the states to finally get Congress off their backs about those debts they owed. Little old Rhode Island, whose last-minute refusal had killed the tax amendment, eagerly pointed out that selling land in the West could go a long way toward paying off that debt. Rhode Island banded together with the other states and pressured Virginia to give up their claims on the West. And since that territory had turned into a giant mess for them anyway, Virginia agreed. Now that Congress controlled the West, they set up rules for how land would be divided up and sold.
And something else to point out about Virginia is that in the years following the Revolutionary War, unlike a lot of the other states, Virginia very quickly did get out of debt. To the point where when Alexander Hamilton becomes the Secretary of the Treasury in the first Washington administration, and his cornerstone plan was that the federal government would assume the debts of all the states. In other words, all of that debt would then be would transfer to the federal government so the federal government could establish credit for itself. Virginia opposed the plan because Virginia, unlike most of the other former colonies, had largely paid off its debts, thanks in large part to the fact that they had a lot of slave labor.
And even for how the towns should be built to include public services like schools and government buildings. Once these new territories reached a population of 20,000, they would join the Confederation and become states. These laws promised security that Western settlers had never had before.
And it's kind of cool. They showed that how townships here in Ohio, we were part of the Northwest Territory, which today is Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, I think. The Northwest Territory was divided up into townships, and each of our townships. So, for example, I grew up in Trumbull County, which is 5 townships by 5 townships. There's, I think, 25 townships total. And each one was the same size, and the center portion of the land was set aside for the schools and things like that. And so even today, you can see the division of land that goes all the way back to the late 1700s, because we have all these townships that are perfect squares that were all set up as part of what, at least here in Ohio, were called the 7 ranges. They were part of the Connecticut Western Reserve. And so you had Town 1, Range 1, Town 2, Range 1, Town 2, Range 2, etc.
And this not only helped shape new communities, but also helped convince the settlers formerly known as Virginians that Congress cared about them too. Yet, this victory did not reverse the Confederation's declining fortunes. Those forts that the British held in the West, well, the British had agreed to leave them when they signed the peace treaty, and in return, Congress had agreed not to punish British citizens who had remained loyal to the crown. Unfortunately, the states repeatedly ignored this agreement by kicking British loyalists off of their land, and repeatedly ignored Congress's requests that they stop it. The Articles of Confederation had made Congress responsible for enforcing foreign treaties, but once again they had no power to make it happen. And the British argued that if the Americans wouldn't uphold their end of the treaty, then they didn't have to do it either. The British stayed in their forts, perfectly positioned to sweep in and pick up the pieces when the United States fell apart.
So you can see why they're figuring out more and more. The Articles of Confederation are just completely powerless for a country that's trying to establish itself on the world stage as an independent nation that can conclude peace treaties and can make alliances and do all of the things that other nations can do. They can't do any of it because even though they kind of have the authority to do that under the Articles of Confederation, the states are just basically ignoring it. So they've got to have something stronger. They've got to have a more powerful central government that can enforce this stuff and actually get things done. Thus the Constitution.
Both Europe and America had begun to take bets on when that would be, since it seemed inevitable at this point. The Western land sales hadn't come close to paying off the national debt, and now the states were making it even worse by printing their own money in open defiance of the Confederation rules stating that they couldn't. They had even begun to fight among themselves. Literally, the states of Connecticut and Pennsylvania were at war over a border dispute. Newspapers had begun openly calling for the states to break apart and form new regional confederations. Many early revolutionaries saw this as the natural order of things. They had built their revolution on distrust for British Parliament, and they had never intended the Confederation Congress to step in and take its place. Their states were their home countries, not some vague idea of a continental union.
And this is a concept and an ideology that will persist up through, at least through the Civil War. And that's why when the Civil War comes along and you have people like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, others, they viewed their state as the object of their allegiance, not the national government. It's a minor thing, but it's true. They said the United States are, when referring to the United States, they referred to it as a plural, a collection of states. It was only after the Civil War that we were viewed much more as one nation rather than a collection of a bunch of states. And so, yeah, I mean, people like Lee, while he said he was a Union guy, when his state broke away, he went with his state because he felt that was where his first allegiance lie. So this is an ideology that goes all the way back to the Revolution.
But the revolution that they had begun had grown out of their control, and the new generation of American statesmen saw things very differently. Men like Alexander Hamilton had fought in the war alongside soldiers from all 13 states, and the one thing that had brought them together was this idea of America, a country that belonged to all of them. Hamilton refused to let his new country fall apart, but years of serving in Congress had convinced him that this weak Confederation government could not be fixed. It had too many fundamental flaws. It couldn't fund itself, it couldn't enforce laws, heck, it couldn't even get its own delegates to show up half the time. Convincing the states to replace the Articles of Confederation with an untested new constitution that had even more power, that would be an uphill battle, but Hamilton had won tough fights before. He just needed an opportunity.
So what they end up doing, and I don't know if they'll mention this or not, is they actually organize what is supposed to be a convention to reform the Articles of Confederation. A lot of people showed up under that assumption. They didn't think they were coming to a constitutional convention that was going to completely write something new. They thought they were just going to tweak what already existed. Surprise.
So he decided to make one. In 1786, a small convention of states gathered to discuss trade policies. The Articles of Confederation left each state free to decide how to manage trade across their borders, and the result had been a complicated mess of competing state laws. Everybody expected to hash out some new specific policies at this convention, but Hamilton insisted that they all look at the bigger picture. Did they really want to meet like this again and again over every river and every trade route they shared with their neighbors? Wouldn't it be easier if they had some central authority whose job it was to decide these matters?
And keep in mind, Alexander Hamilton at this point is like 30 years old. He's still a really young guy. And he's in these conventions as kind of like the third man. You know, it's like the Constitutional Convention. There are, I think, 3 delegates from New York. And he was like the third wheel, so to speak. The other 2 guys didn't agree with him on most things. He was kind of brought along as like the junior guy. But Hamilton, time and time again, used his intellect, used his charisma, used his ability to kind of advance to the head of the pack. And that's what he does here.
Someone like, I don't know, Congress? By the end of the week, the states had made Hamilton their spokesperson and authorized him to call for another convention to reform the Articles of Confederation. But only 5 of the 13 states had even bothered to attend this first meeting. If Hamilton wanted to change the government, he needed to convince them all to attend the next one. He needed to make it a show, to prove to the states that the one American they all respected took this convention seriously.
Yep.
He needed star power.
Yep.
He needed George Washington. Washington had wanted to replace the Articles of Confederation since watching his soldiers nearly starve to death at Valley Forge, but he had since retired home to Virginia
And Washington, all his life, all he wanted to do was just go home to Mount Vernon and be a gentleman farmer. That's what he wanted. But he had this sense of duty, and he felt like he was in a position where he had a responsibility. And so time and time again, he's called, and time again, he says, okay.
and sworn off public life. He didn't want to use his fame as America's first general to become a dictator. But if he attended, Hamilton knew that important people from every state would want to be there. Even Benjamin Franklin might take a break from his new hobby of inventing bifocals to pick up his old hobby of writing constitutions. Hamilton turned to his friend and fellow congressman James Madison for help. Madison came from the same state as George Washington, but he had always been the odd man out in Virginia politics. Where other statesmen loved to showboat and brag about their accomplishments, Madison worked quietly to get things done and let others take the credit. He had pushed for the tax amendment, he had helped convince Virginia to give up its western land claims, and he had organized the small convention that Hamilton had used to call for the reform of the Confederation. Now the time had come at last for him to step into the public eye and earn a place in history.
And it's kind of one of the sad things about where this ends up is that eventually Hamilton and Madison become enemies. Because Hamilton, once he gets into the government, is very much about the strongest possible central government. In fact, during the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton pushes for things like hereditary titles, for the Senate to be like the House of Lords, where their titles that are their appointments for life. Hamilton is practically a monarchist in what he's pushing for with the central government, whereas Madison is not quite there, and they'll end up once the Constitution is passed, find themselves on opposite sides.
He started telling everybody that George Washington had agreed to attend this new convention as one of the delegates from Virginia. Now, Washington had agreed to no such thing, but Madison met with him privately and said, "Hey, be cool, I'm not expecting you to actually be there. You just tell everybody that you'll be there so that they show up, because we both agree this meeting needs to happen, right? And after they have already committed to showing up, you can just cancel, and I'll look like an idiot, but that's okay because we can still get what we want." Washington agreed to go along with this, but Madison's plans extended even farther. While pretending that he was merely keeping Washington updated about the convention, Madison started to send him information about everyone who would attend. He sought Washington's advice on what to do about the Articles of Confederation, gradually allowing Washington to feel like replacing the Articles with an entirely new constitution was his idea. Little by little, he persuaded Washington that not only would the convention be a success, but that it would actually look really bad if the hero of the revolution decided to not attend this historic constitutional convention.
So Madison plays everybody here. Hey, Washington's going to be there. Washington, you don't actually have to come. And then he starts getting him more involved. Washington, it's going to look really bad if you don't show up. And it just kind of brings it all together. And Madison's the guy who takes all the notes, and he's actually known as the father of the Constitution.
And so Washington, ever mindful of his legacy, decided, all right, you know what? I'm actually going to go to this thing. Now that he and Hamilton had their star guest, Madison left nothing to chance. He read philosophies and histories that helped him to build an exhaustive counterargument to every possible objection about the evils of central government. He compiled a list of every failure under the Articles of Confederation, a scathing 13-page record of starving troops, broken treaties, and failed legislation. When the convention met, he sat down with his fellow delegates from Virginia, including Washington, and convinced them all to adopt his so-called Virginia Plan. A plan that called for the Articles of Confederation to be abolished and replaced with a new constitution. Some hesitated to accept this bold idea, but as soon as they realized that Washington endorsed it, none of them wanted to oppose him. Finally, on May 25th, 1787, delegates from all 13 states met and chose George Washington to lead the Constitutional Convention. Immediately, the Virginia delegation laid out their plan to replace the Articles of Confederation. Over the next few months, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison led debates that picked apart the Articles' flaws and recast them into a centralized government with powers specifically granted to deal with all of the issues the Confederation Congress had struggled to resolve.
When Hamilton, and they talk about this in the Hamilton musical, and it's true too, when Hamilton stands up to speak, to lay out his own plan and to give his thoughts, the man speaks for 6 hours without a break, didn't go to the bathroom, didn't take a break to have a meal. He spoke for 6 hours. And Madison, we don't know for sure what all he talked about because Madison was keeping notes from the meeting, but those notes were kept private because they didn't want. They wanted people to be able to speak their mind without those words being used against them. Well, the problem was a lot of what Hamilton shares, a lot of what he does to speak his mind, is later used against him in his political career. They constantly throw at him some of the things that he proposed in the Constitutional Convention, accusing him of being British and being a monarchist and being pro-Britain and anti-French and all this kind of stuff.
Together, they created the United States Constitution. But that's a story for another time.
But what if that story never happened? What if the Articles of Confederation never got replaced, and the U.S. never got a new constitution?
Hello. Who are you?
I'm Cody from the Alternate History Hub. Someone on YouTube told me that you guys like to leave your studio open, so guests like me can drop by the show.
Okay, that's not quite true.
It could be true. That's kind of what I do. I talk about what might have happened if things went a little bit differently. The what-ifs of the world. Like, what if the Articles of Confederation stuck around? What might have happened to the United States?
That actually does sound really interesting.
So that'll be something we'll definitely have to explore down the road. But as I promised, the next extra history series I'm going to do is going to be Admiral Yi. So that'll be coming very soon. And I'm going to check on how the voting's going over on Patreon to see what the series will be after that. But for now, that's all. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we will see you again soon. Thanks for watching.